For years, many fans believed Christine McVie's passing came after a brief illness, and that was where the story ended. But as more details about her final days became publicly known, a far more heartbreaking picture emerged. Behind the headlines was a devastating secret, and what happened in her final hours was marked by a tragedy that few people fully understood. When the news broke on November 30th, 2022, the statement her family released was soft and careful. She had passed away peacefully in hospital following a short illness. That was all anyone was given, and out of respect, that was all anyone asked for. The music world mourned and assumed some gentle sickness had simply taken her in her sleep. But grief makes us accept the easy answer, because the easy answer hurts a little less. Nobody wanted to dig, and so the real story sat inside a legal document for months. Then came April 3rd, 2023. A celebrity news outlet obtained her official death certificate, and what was written there did not match the gentle story the public had been handed. Not even close. The certificate listed her primary cause of death as an ischemic stroke. That is what happens when the blood supply to part of the brain gets cut off, and the tissue suddenly stops getting oxygen. But the stroke was only the final blow. Underneath it sat something far stranger and more frightening. The document also recorded bilateral renal infarction, meaning blood flow to both kidneys had been choked off. There was a large atrial thrombus, a serious blood clot sitting inside a chamber of her heart. And there was atrial fibrillation, an irregular heartbeat that wildly increases the chance of a deadly stroke. This was not one quiet illness gently closing the curtain. This was a cascade of failures stacking on top of one another, each feeding the next, while the world outside had no idea. And we have not even reached the part that made doctors lean in closer. The words written on the certificate were these: metastatic malignancy of unknown primary origin. Metastatic means the cancer had already spread. It had broken loose from wherever it first began and traveled through her body, planting itself in new places. But of unknown primary origin means the doctors found the cancer everywhere it had spread to, yet could not find where it began. The seeds had scattered far and wide, but the original soil was a ghost. This condition is called cancer of unknown primary, and it is one of the cruelest diagnoses in all of medicine. According to the American Cancer Society, only around 2 out of every 100 cancer cases fall into this category. But rarity is not the worst of it. The worst of it is the speed. Fewer than 1 in 4 people diagnosed with it are still alive a year later, and fewer than 1 in 10 reach the 5-year mark. A cancer that hides its own face from the doctors, hunting it, spreading aggressively before anyone even realizes an attack is underway. By the time it announces itself, it has usually already won. There is something almost unbearably poetic buried in all of this. Christine McVie was the most private woman in one of the most exposed bands on the planet. While her bandmates lived loud and tangled public lives, she stayed quiet, guarded, unknowable, her pain locked away behind closed doors. And in the very end, the thing that took her was a cancer whose origin was a secret even from the experts trying to save her. A private woman, taken by a private killer that refused to show its face. She had actually tried to warn us in her own gentle way. In one of her final interviews with Rolling Stone, she admitted she was in quite bad health. She spoke about a chronic back problem breaking her down, about not feeling up to performing anymore. She said the mind is willing, but the flesh is weak. We all assumed she meant the ordinary aches of growing older. None of us had the faintest idea what was really circling her in the dark. But to understand why her death struck such a deep nerve, you have to understand who she was long before any of this began. Before she was Christine McVie, before the platinum records and sold-out stadiums. She was Christine and perfect. Yes, perfect. That was genuinely her surname. Born on July 12, 1943, in a tiny village in England's Lake District. Imagine carrying a name like that through school. She laughed about it later, telling The Guardian her teachers would say they hoped she would live up to her name. She joked that she had been perfect right up until the day she married John. Her childhood home was unlike anyone else's. Her father, Cyril, was a concert violinist and music lecturer. Her grandfather had been an organist at Westminster Abbey. But it was her mother who gave this whole story its strange and haunting flavor. Her mother, Beatrice, was a medium, a psychic, a faith healer. And Christine genuinely believed, with her whole heart, that her mother's gifts were real. She once told a story about a dying woman, terminally ill and far beyond hope, right up until Beatrice handed her one of her own gloves to wear through the night. By morning, the illness had simply lifted. Christine was raised to believe there were forces moving through this world we cannot measure or name. Hold tightly to that, because years later she would describe writing her most beautiful song as though a spirit had drifted into her room in the dead of night. She trained on the piano from the age of 4, classical and precise. She might have grown up to become a quiet music teacher, but then her older brother carelessly left a Fats Domino songbook lying around the house. The moment her fingers found those rolling, joyful boogie-woogie rhythms, the polite classical girl quietly died and something far wilder woke up in her place. She went off to art college to study sculpture and instead tumbled straight into the smoky, electric world of the British blues scene. The blues clubs of England in the 1960s were a rough and thrilling place for a young woman to land. She joined a band called Chicken Shack as their keyboard player and singer, and almost immediately people realized this art student had a voice that could stop a noisy room dead. Low, warm, lived in, the kind of voice that already knows how your heart is going to break before you do. In 1969, she recorded a cover of I'd Rather Go Blind, and it turned into a genuine hit. Melody Maker crowned her their best female vocalist 2 years running. Around this same period, she had grown close to the bass player of a rising blues band called Fleetwood Mac, a man named John McVie. They married in 1968, and the best man at their wedding was the band's brilliant and troubled guitarist, Peter Green. The girl who was teased for being a perfect became a McVie, and she would carry that name all the way into legend. For a while she orbited the band without ever quite being inside it. She played piano on their records without any credit, and even painted the cover art for one of their albums. Then fate cleared a path through somebody else's tragedy. Peter Green suddenly left, his brilliant mind coming undone. So in 1970, they turned to the woman who had been standing just off stage and asked Christine to join properly. As Mick Fleetwood put it years later, she became the glue, the thing that held all of these volatile, brilliant, beautifully damaged people together. On the final day of 1974, 2 Americans walked into the band, Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks. The instant Christine and Stevie stood together, their voices wrapped around each other as though they had been singing side by side their whole lives. They made a quiet promise that they would never be treated as anything less than equals. What happened next is almost beyond belief. As the band climbed toward recording their masterpiece, the album called Rumours, every single relationship inside the group detonated at once. Christine and John divorced. Stevie and Lindsey shattered. The drummer's own marriage was crumbling too. They were heartbroken, furious, betrayed, and barely able to speak to one another. And then they walked into the studio together and poured every drop of that agony directly into the songs. Christine, in the very middle of her own divorce, sat down and wrote the most hopeful, warm, comforting songs the band ever produced. She wrote Don't Stop, a song reaching toward a brighter tomorrow, while her own marriage was quietly dying in the next room. She wrote You Make Loving Fun, a giddy love song about an affair with the band's lighting director, and let her husband go on believing it was about their dog. And then there is the song that proves her mother's strange world had stayed alive inside her all along. One night, around 3:30 in the morning, Christine woke with a complete melody already formed in her head. She walked to the piano and played Songbird, start to finish, in roughly 30 minutes. She later described it as though she had been visited by something, a very spiritual thing. She was so frightened of losing it that she sat up the rest of the night playing it over and over so she would not forget a single note by morning. Mick Fleetwood came to love that song so deeply that he has asked for it to be played at his own funeral one day. The success of Rumours was staggering. The album has sold somewhere north of 40 million copies, and the band has moved well over 100 million records across their career. With that money and pressure came a lifestyle that would have flattened weaker souls. Christine was remarkably honest about it later. She told The Guardian that her substance of choice was cocaine and champagne. She described a world where cocaine was simply everywhere, a normal part of the working day. She once stayed awake for 3 full days, until her heart frightened her so badly she felt she was on the edge of a heart attack. That raw terror was finally enough. She walked away from every bit of it for good. There was far more pain than just the chemicals. There was a wild and consuming love affair with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, a man she described as charismatic and charming and a glorious mess all at once. Only a few years after it ended, he drowned at the age of 39. Loss seemed to trail quietly after her. Underneath it all ran a constant current of quiet suffering the public never saw. Chronic back pain, stage fright, the exhaustion of being a private woman trapped inside a touring machine that never stopped moving. She was an English country girl in her soul who wanted nothing more than to pull on muddy boots and potter about in a garden. And instead she lived on airplanes and in identical hotel rooms, performing her own heartbreak for thousands of strangers every single night. By the late 1990s, it finally snapped. She developed a paralyzing fear of flying, a genuine phobia with panic attacks. And so in 1998, at the peak of her fame, freshly inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Christine McVie did something almost no superstar ever does. She quit. She walked away from the band, from the spotlight, from every bit of it, and vanished quietly into the English countryside. She bought herself a grand old Tudor manor house in Kent and set about becoming the country woman she had always longed to be. She gardened. She restored the house room by room. But 16 years is a long time to stay away from the one thing you were born to do. The reason she stayed gone was that flying phobia, which had wrapped itself around her like the bars of a cage. She was free of the road at last, and yet trapped by her own fear. The way she finally conquered that fear puts a chill right through you. A therapist gave her one simple piece of advice: go buy a plane ticket to Maui, where Mick Fleetwood happened to live. She did exactly that. She and her old bandmate boarded the flight together, and as the plane lifted off the ground, the very thing she had dreaded for years loosened its grip and let go. She described the feeling afterward in a single word: free. And so, in 2014, after 16 long years in the wilderness, Christine McVie finally came home. She rejoined Fleetwood Mac, and the classic lineup stood together on a stage again. In a moment that feels eerily prescient given the recent wave of legacy acts like ABBA reuniting through digital avatars, Christine's return reminded the world that some magic can only happen in the flesh. It would be a mistake to think of Christine only as 1/5 of Fleetwood Mac. In 1980, for she released a solo album and pulled in some of the greatest living musicians to help her make it. Eric Clapton walked into the studio and laid down a guitar solo. The album handed her a genuine solo hit with Got a Hold on Me, which climbed into the top 10 of the American charts. She received the Brit Award for Outstanding Contribution to Music and the Ivor Novello Award for Lifetime Achievement. She was never just a band member filling out the sound. She was one of the most gifted songwriters her country ever produced. Which brings us, finally, back around to her own goodbye. That friendship between Christine and Stevie Nicks turned out to be one of the great love stories in all of music, a genuine sisterhood. Stevie called Christine her best friend in the entire world. They shared hotel rooms, did each other's makeup, and laughed their way through decades together. When Christine fell ill at the very end, it happened so suddenly that Stevie barely understood what was occurring. She wanted desperately to reach her friend in time. She was prepared to rent a private plane and fly straight to London to sit on Christine's bed and sing to her one last time. But the family told her not to come because Christine might not survive the night. And the very next day, she was gone. Stevie never made it there. She never got to hold her hand. In her own aching words, she did not get to say goodbye. Stevie wrote a handwritten note to the whole world, raw and broken open, saying she had just lost her best friend and had not even known she was ill. She signed off with a line that lingers: "See you on the other side, my love. Don't forget me." Mick Fleetwood wrote that part of his own heart had flown away that day. Lindsey Buckingham called her a musical comrade, a friend, a soulmate, and a sister. And so we arrive at the quietest and heaviest truth of all. Without Christine, there simply is no Fleetwood Mac left. Mick Fleetwood has said the line in the sand has finally been drawn, that carrying on now feels unthinkable. Stevie Nicks put it even more plainly. Without Christine, she said no can do. The glue that had held them together for 50 long years was gone. She gave the world its most hopeful songs, while privately carrying a weight none of us could see. And in the very end, she was taken by a darkness not even her own doctors could trace to its source, a killer without a face, a secret she kept right up until her last breath. The most private woman in all of rock and roll, mysterious to the very last note. Which Christine McVie song still gives you chills after all these years? And where were you the first time you heard it? Share your story in the comments below.